How's everybody doing? My name is Dr. Michael Buffano. I'm a professor with East Tennessee State University. So I am a scholar of Middle East politics, and I'm going to start a series of lectures on the politics of the Middle East, this being the first of many. And you can see within, on my YouTube page, you could also go and watch those other lectures. The point of this series is to introduce students to the politics of the region. You're going to be learning a lot about the similarities and differences across this particular part of the world throughout this lecture series. Now, these videos are not going to be a typical YouTube video. Okay, they're going to average about 50 minutes each, and it's going to involve a more substantive discussion on academic material. I don't expect to get a ton of views for each of these videos because they're not the type of typical videos that are meant to capture people's attention right away. Instead, it requires a lot of deep thought and a lot of extensive learning about this region of the world. In fact, I highly recommend going and getting academic books and journal articles on this region and reading about it as you're watching these lecture videos. This is really meant for students of the region, those who are planning on going into diplomacy or planning on going into academia who want to learn more about this part of the world. Okay, so I'm not going to present to you, a 5-minute clip about how you could understand everything about this region of the world. I don't think that's possible. I think there are way too many influencers out there that are trying to oversimplify this region of the world, and I think that's highly problematic. So in this lecture, this first one, I'm going to introduce you to the politics of the Middle East. So, first, we have to understand what exactly is the Middle East. All right. So, we're going to understand the origins of this term and where it's been applied, this term geographically. So, that's number one. You're going to find out very problematic term in and of itself. Now, we're also going to understand what makes the Middle East a political region, right? Why study something as a region to begin with? So that's part of what this lecture is about. And finally, we're also going to understand as well that there's a lot of diversity across this region. We're going to deconstruct stereotypes of the Middle East. You're going to learn what an Orientalist is and what an apologist is. And we want to avoid both of those things. We don't want to overly summarize this region and oversimplify it to whether to reinforce negative or positive stereotypes about this positive part of the world. Instead, we want to use data, empirical evidence to understand variation across this region. So, as well as, of course, what makes this region similar and different to other parts of the world. So, let's get to it. The term Middle East, where exactly does this very strange term come from? It sounds a little weird, right? The Middle East. So, what is this thing about? Well, it was actually created by the British. It was a term that emerged under British imperialism and was used a lot from the 19th to the early 20th century, okay, by British imperial authorities. And for a variety of reasons, it just kind of stuck to the region. Now, why did the British call this region eventually the Middle East? Well, it has to do with the very extensive nature of the British Empire. See, by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the British had an empire where the sun did not set on it. All across the world, the British had colonies, from India to various parts of sub-Saharan Africa to the Middle East and North Africa and elsewhere in the world. And so, for example, some of their colonies were in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Asia. So, for example, they had a colony in India, they had a sphere of influence in China, and they called this part of their colonial empire the Far East. Now, why? Because it was located really far to the east of Great Britain, right? So, it makes sense so far. All right, so that's part of it. Now, they also had this other term, Near East. Okay, this was for the lands of the Mediterranean. Okay, those that were just kind of to the south and just to the east of Great Britain. So parts of what are known as North Africa. Okay, so Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, so these kind of countries that are now located in North Africa, as well as the countries of the Levant, okay, Syria, what is now Palestine. So the different parts of what are now, what were then in the 19th century located part of this great Islamic empire known as the Ottoman Empire. So they called this area the Near East, okay? So the eastern territories to the east of Great Britain that were located closest to them. And finally, they had this term Middle East used to describe the lands in between these two regions of the world. So the Middle East was initially just used to refer to around where Iraq and Iran are now located. Okay, so basically in the middle of the Near East and the Far East. So they had these different categories based on how far away was located from Great Britain. Now, eventually, this term Middle East would just kind of stick and eventually be applied to a much wider region that stretches from North Africa all the way to Afghanistan in Central Asia. So eventually, the term Middle East would stick, and even the peoples of the region would come to use it. So in Arabic, it's called the Sharq al-Awsat, which means literally means the Middle East. So it is because of colonialism that this region today has its name. Okay, that's where it comes from. So even its name comes with a lot of controversy, right? And by the way, this is very common in history for outsiders and conquerors to give names to other parts of the world. This is not something that's necessarily unique. And so now, as a result, we have this term Middle East. Now, a couple of things geographically about how the term is applied. There are some differences across the academic scholarship about what the Middle East constitutes. So, for example, some scholars have included these countries in the Middle East. The countries extending from, sometimes it's just from Egypt to Iran and from Turkey down south to Yemen and Oman here. Sometimes Sudan, Libya, and Afghanistan are included. And other scholars go farther and add the countries of North Africa, the MENA countries. Okay, so the countries of the Middle East and North Africa. So, sometimes Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, even Mauritania, which is just south of Morocco, are also included here. So there are differences across the literature about what the Middle East constitutes. Now, in this course, I am going to discuss the countries of the Middle East and North Africa, which is known by its acronym, the MENA region. You're going to find out in a second why I include all of these countries. They do have a couple of major things in common that really make it worthwhile to studying them as a region of the world. Okay, of course, there's a lot of differences across this region, and I acknowledge some scholars have more limited definitions. There is a bit of subjectivity here, although as you're going to find out, there is a lot here that this region has in common. Now, what makes this a region? Now, you could pause this video for a second and ask yourself, what comes to mind when you think about the Middle East? Like, what are some of the things that makes this a region of the world? So I want you to take a second, think about this, and then start the lecture up again. All right, well, if you've done that, now we could kind of talk about what makes this worthwhile in terms of studying a region. Now, within political science, there are a group of scholars called comparative political scientists. These are people who study and compare different countries and different regions of the world to understand what makes them different and similar. And a lot of scholars study particular regions and they focus on them in part because regions have their own unique dynamics and scholars need to develop various skills to study those regions, whether it's linguistic skills, whether it's, actually living in these regions of the world. And of course, because these regions have in common, if you specialize in various topics, this then could allow you to become a regional specialist. Now, what makes the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, its own region of the world? Well, number one, part of it is certainly the great importance of the Islamic faith and the Arabic language historically. So the overwhelming majority of these countries, in fact, all but one of the countries in the region are of the Islamic majority, meaning over 50% of the people in that country, okay, is a Muslim majority country. So they believe in the Islamic faith. And number two, all but three countries have Arabic as spoken as the majority language. Okay, so just about all of these countries in the region speak Arabic as the majority language. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't Muslim countries outside of this region. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, we have the country Indonesia, which is actually the largest Islamic country of the world. That's located outside of our region. And in sub Saharan Africa, there are various Islamic majority countries out there, such as Mali, such as Senegal, for example. That's not going to be part of our case studies. So certainly there are other Islamic countries out there, but what makes this region unique is that it's almost entirely dominated by the Islamic faith as well as by the Arabic language. Now, of course, another thing that this region has in common is European colonization. Although, unlike Latin America, the Americas colonization was relatively late in the game for Europe. It came from the mid to the late 19th century until the early 20th century. So most of these countries at one point or another were colonized. Algeria was the first major colony here, the first long-term colony in 1830, although even going back to Napoleon in 1798, and Egypt very briefly, the French were in Egypt for 3 years. Algeria was the first major colony, and eventually Europeans would completely pull out of these colonies by 1968. So we do have a period of a little over a century of European rule, and this would play a great role in shaping the nature of this region of the world, okay, in terms of how many of its borders were drawn, in terms of the type of political systems that were emerged. Although I do want you to keep in mind that, of course, this is not the only region of the world that was colonized. In fact, this region of the world does have a lot of things in common with sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and the Americas, right? Because it does share this European colonial history. Now, another thing that this region of the world does have in common is that there were as well a lot of anti-colonial revolts that led to independence and protest movements, as well as the emergence of nationalist ideologies in many of these countries after independence. Many of these ideologies were, at least initially, anti-Western in nature. So we see the emergence of ideologies such as socialism, communism, political Islamism, and we also see the emergence of nationalism that pushed back against European rule and pushed for independence, as well as unity in the aftermath of colonial rule across the region to resist Western influence in the region. So after World War I, when most of the region had become colonized, we see the emergence of these nationalist ideologies and eventually independence and the emergence of modern states in the region after World War I. Once again, we see a lot of things in common with sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia, lots of anti-colonial movements in those regions of the world. And as a result, there is some tensions with the quote unquote West. Okay. And I use that term very loosely. It's a very subjective concept. And by that, I mean North America and Western Europe. Okay. Countries like Great Britain, France, Germany, the United States, so on and so forth. So we do have some tension in the Middle East, okay, over Western influence. Some of the other things that this region does have in common is that it does suffer from a lot of armed conflict. Okay, so for example, countries like Palestine and Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Algeria, Turkey have suffered from a lot of problems with internal conflict like civil war, as well as international conflicts with their neighbors. Okay. And so, this is a region that's had a lot of problems with political violence. So that's part of this course is along with understanding, factors like European colonization and how the Islamic faith and the Arabic language and how nationalist ideologies have impacted the region. We're also going to understand how armed conflict has impacted this region of the world. Now, another thing you might associate with the Middle East is the issue of authoritarianism. Most of the countries across this region of the world are authoritarian in nature. Okay, so there has been a struggle with democratization in this part of the world. In fact, the Middle East has the most dictatorships as a percentage of the types of regimes in the region. Okay, the rules of the game. Okay, so most of the countries in the region are dictatorships. We're going to understand in this class why that is the case. And as you're going to find out as well, there are a great mix of different dictatorships. Some of them are republics with fixed elections. Some of them, such as the Arab Gulf countries, are monarchies. So we're going to understand why authoritarianism has persisted in the region, as well as the different types of dictatorships. There's been all sorts of types: military regimes, single party republics, what we call electoral authoritarian regimes, that they allow an opposition to exist, but the elections are fixed. There are monarchies that have existed in the region as well. So we're going to understand a lot about this. We're also going to understand as well the pernicious influence of oil and foreign aid in the region. This region has the most oil resources per capita in the world. So just like countries in sub-Saharan Africa, there are many countries in that region of the world dependent on what we call rents, such as oil and mineral resources, that is natural resources. The same is true of the Middle East. Okay, there are a lot of countries, particularly in the Arab Gulf, countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, heavily dependent on oil resources. As you're going to find out, this has also helped to entrench authoritarianism in this part of the world. And because of the strategic importance of the Middle East, because of these resources, its geostrategic importance, it has received a lot of foreign aid from countries like the United States. So we're going to learn a lot about how this has impacted the region. And finally, actually, I should say second to last, we're going to also as well learn a lot about the influence of political Islam. As you're going to find out, a lot of people in this region support the mixing of church and state. And I'm going to show you this with polling data. It's approximately half of the people in the region today support a mixing of religion with politics. So we're going to understand about the influence of political Islam. Okay, so we'll talk a lot about political parties that support this type of ideology. We're going to talk a lot about social movements and charity movements. We'll talk a lot about Muslim Democrats, that is, political Islamists that also support democracy. We're also going to talk a lot about terrorist movements, Salafi jihadist organizations like Al Qaeda and why they emerged in the region, and the impacts of the war on terrorism on this part of the world. And finally, we're also as well going to talk about the pressures for democratization in the region and the mass revolutions that broke out across many of these Arab-speaking countries from 2010 to 2011. As you're going to find out, there is also as well growing support for democracy in the region. And you might have read in the news recently about the great protests that took place across the Arab Spring and the aftermath of that, the civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, as well as the democratization process in Tunisia, as well as why some democratization processes failed in countries like Egypt. So we're going to talk a lot about this in this class. Now, with that said, while the region has a lot in common, and some of those factors I talked about are common factors across many of the countries, we also have to keep in mind there's a lot of diversity in this region. I am not, throughout the course of this semester, going to overly simplify this region. I highly recommend reading the book Orientalism by Edward Said. Across Western media, there's often been the case where some media outlets have promoted a lot of negative stereotypes about this region of the world. Ideas such as, all countries in the Middle East are dictatorships, or all Muslims are, in favor of mixing religion and politics, or all Muslims are, in favor of violence, okay, or all of the Middle East has suffered from political conflict. This is not the case, okay? There's a tremendous amount of diversity across the Middle East as well, okay? There are always exceptions to the rule. There are always, diversity within any of the case studies we are going to study, okay? We want to avoid generalizations here. So that's part of what we're going to learn about this, and I want you to stop this video and think, what are some of the negative stereotypes that are associated with this region of the world? So to kind of, just break down some of these stereotypes. First, number one, while yes, it is very true that the majority of people in this region are Arabic speakers, there's a ton of linguistic diversity. So Turkey, Iran, and Israel, these countries are not majority Arabic speaking countries. In Turkey, it's the Turkish language. In Iran, the majority language is Farsi. And in Israel, it's Hebrew. Okay, so that's number one, linguistic diversity, ton of it. Number two, there's religious diversity. While the vast majority of people are Muslim, there are Christian minorities spread all across the region. In fact, until relatively recently, the majority of people in Lebanon were Christian, although this has changed because of demographic shifts. On top of that, of course, Israel is a Jewish majority country. And we also have as well within the Islamic faith a ton of diversity. There are Sunni and Shia Muslims, for example, and there is a great variety of Shia Muslims across the world. We're going to learn a lot about that throughout this course and why this matters for politics. And there are also other smaller religious minorities like the Druze, for example, the Yazidi, tons of different diverse groups out there across this part of the world. Okay, so tons of religious diversity, and we also have a lot of linguistic minorities. So we have groups like the Kurds in northern Iraq, northeastern Syria, southeastern Turkey, and northwestern Iran. There's the Amazigh minority spread out across North Africa. So we cannot overly simplify this region of the world, nor can we understand its politics if we have these kind of simplistic assumptions. Number two, not all countries were colonized, okay? So Saudi Arabia and Turkey were never directly colonized by European powers. And in fact, you're actually going to learn how this impacted some of the diversity in the politics of the region later in the semester. So an important point to bring up. Number three, a few countries actually do have a history of having a state prior to colonization. Well, certainly modernization in the region was in part influenced through European colonization. A lot of parts of the Middle East, particularly a lot of the provinces of the Ottoman Empire, did respond prior to European colonization with modernization reforms, investing in things like industry and a modern infrastructure. Okay, in Ottoman provinces like Egypt and Tunisia, for example. So there are countries that have a history of having modernization processes before European colonization. And of course, before European influence, this is a region of the world with a long history of contributions to civilization, to mathematics, to literature, to art, to music, to culture, and so on and so forth. We're going to be learning a bit about this throughout this course. Number four, not all countries have had violent conflicts. Okay, so the Arab Gulf region has been relatively stable politically, economically, and socially in comparison with other parts of the Middle East and North Africa. So, for example, the United Arab Emirates never had a civil war, in the modern era. So, relatively peaceful country here. In contrast, Iraq has been just really just decimated by conflicts, internal violence, as well as international wars over the last couple of decades. So lots of diversity across this region. So part of this course is to understand the diversity in this region. Why is it that the Arab Gulf has not had the civil wars that other regions have had? Now, number five, not all countries have always been dictatorships in this region. So there are four major cases of countries that have had democracies at various periods in time. So, Turkey at various periods of time has had competitive elections, Lebanon, Israel, and Tunisia. Now, of course, as you're going to learn, there's a lot of problems with all of those countries. So we'll talk about, the various issues. Israel with its long occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip of Palestinian territory, and Turkey has had problems with conflicts with its Kurdish minority. It's had some democratic backsliding recently. Tunisia had a 10-year period of being a democracy before this all collapsed in 2011. So not all countries have always been dictatorships in this region. Several countries as well are not oil dependent. So, yeah, you got a lot of oil in the Arab Gulf. About 50% of the world's oil is located in the Arab Gulf. And you also have other cases like Libya and Algeria with a lot of oil. And of course, Iran and its control of the Gulf as well, the Persian Gulf, it has its own set of oil resources. But other countries like Turkey, Tunisia, Lebanon, very little or no oil at all. So several countries are not oil dependent, and a few countries even have industrial sectors, Israel, Turkey, and Tunisia among them. And, of course, while there are a lot of political Islamists across the region that support the mixing of church and state, first off, about half of this region, according to polling, consists of people who are secular, who don't support the mixing of church and state. And amongst political Islamists, the vast majority actually support democracy. They think it's the best form of rule. We know this from polling, not from subjective perspectives. Okay. I have data, very clear data on this. So let's get this out of our heads here. Tremendous diversity amongst not only Muslims in terms of whether or not they support secularism or political Islamism, that is the mixing of religion and politics, but even amongst political Islamists themselves. Now, while terrorism does exist in different parts of the region, there are certainly radical groups like Al Qaeda. The vast majority of people, once again, according to polling, do not support terrorism. Okay, so this is just within the polling. Now, one last thing I do want to bring up here, though. I am not here to present an apologist narrative to you folks out there. Okay, we have to go into the realities of this region. Kind of tropes that you do sometimes find from what we call apologists. That is people who try to apologize for all the problems of a region of the world like the Middle East, are also not true. This idea that all Muslims are people is just as ridiculous as saying all Christians are peaceful, or all Jews are peaceful, or all atheists are peaceful. This is just quite frankly not true. There are people in this region that have engaged in violence and have defended that violence for a variety of reasons. And yes, you can make the subjective argument that in some cases, particularly under oppression, under foreign occupation, that maybe sometimes this violence was justified, although in other cases you could argue that this violence was not. Furthermore, while there are a lot of people that do support democratization, there are massive problems with authoritarian retrenchment in this part of the world. And yes, there are some people that do support authoritarianism. We have to understand the complex dynamics of this region of the world. Now, on a final note, just because I'm bringing up these problems in the Middle East does not mean that I am ignoring other parts of the world. As you're going to find out, a lot of these problems in the region are in fact caused by outside dynamics. So the influence of other regions of the world, whether that be the western part of the world, the Soviet Union, or in its aftermath, the Russian states, whether that be, problems coming from sub-Saharan Africa and challenges such as migration. There are tons of problems in this part of the world that have been in part caused by outside actors. Now, there are some positives as well that have come from these outside regions, but there's also a lot of problems, particularly from the part of the world I come from, the Western part of the world, right? So I was born in the United States. So, of course, we have to study these issues. At the same time, though, we don't want to just state that all of the problems in the Middle East are caused by some outside region, because this would also be oversimplifying the region. This is a complex region. We cannot overly summarize why things are problematic in this part of the world. Okay, so that's what this course is about. We're going to be learning a lot about the Middle East over the next couple of months. So I highly recommend watching my lectures. Feel free to ask comments down below. And, just on a last final note, just about the structure of these lectures, these are not typical YouTube videos that are less than 10 minutes long and have a lot of shiny and fancy pictures and videos, okay, that are meant to capture your attention for a few seconds. These are meant to be in-depth, deep lectures. They're not meant for mass viewing, but they are meant for specifically students of the region and those with a very specific interest in the Middle East that want to understand its complex dynamics. Okay, and yeah, that probably means you should probably coming into this with some basic knowledge on what political science is, as well as some basic knowledge about just the social sciences in general, right? So this is not meant to be an introductory video to the Middle East. It's meant to be in depth. Okay, so thanks, guys, for tuning in and paying attention. I will see you all later. Have a good